Now let's go back to our pictures. So instead of having a letter like that, we're going back to columns of pictures. So what is happening exactly to the last column? Well, it's not really occupying 1/4 of the width of the container, even though we set the flex property to 1, meaning that each column should actually have the same width. Well, the thing is, the images inside the last column don't have any styling at the moment, so we haven't set their width using CSS. So they occupy their initial width. Okay? And this means that the last column or the last flex item inside your flexbox or inside this row in the flexbox needs to contain elements inside it, which are these pictures. And since these pictures, they occupy all that width, then that column cannot be smaller than the width of its inner images. So the width of that column is going to fit the width of the biggest image inside the column. Okay? So what's happening then to the other flex items inside our flexbox? Well, they just share whatever space is remaining after giving the first column whichever space it needs. Now let's see what happens when we fill column C with pictures. Well, now we can see only 3 columns, right? But actually there are 4 columns because the 4th column has been pushed to a new line. And you can see that the 4th column occupies the full width of the container because it's the only column or it's the only flex item inside its row. So it can actually occupy the full width available inside that row since it's got a flex property. Or, to be accurate, since it's got a flex grow property. If you remember, setting flex to a positive number like that means that flex grow is set to 1. Now here is a question for you to make sure that you understand Flexbox properly. Why was this flex item or this column has been pushed to a new row? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's because we set the flex wrap property to wrap. If we change that to the default value, which is no wrap, then we're going to have all columns inside this row. Okay. And this time something really interesting happened. All flex items are now inside the same row since we can't wrap them into a second row. And the other interesting thing is that the first 2 columns have now shrunk to their minimum size, even though we've got flex set to 1. Now the reason behind that is that the images that we've got inside our columns, they disrupt how our flexbox works because their width is so big that a quarter of the width of the container is not enough to contain them inside a column. So what happened here is that those 2 columns became so big and they pushed the other 2 columns into a really small width. But if you fill those 2 first columns with images, like this, then those 2 columns are also going to fit their images by increasing in width. And now we end up with a really long row with 4 really big columns. Now, to fix this, we need to control the width of these images. So what we can do is select the images and make sure that they follow the width of their container, which is the column in this case. So you're going to set the width property to 100%, meaning that they are going to follow whatever width we gave to the columns inside our flexbox, or the flex items inside our flexbox. Now you can see that each column occupies 1/4 of the width of the container, right? Now, what if I get rid of this width property and I go back to this scenario where we've got really big columns or wide flex items, and I set the width of each column to 25%. Well, there is a small improvement there, and you can see that each column now occupies 1/4 of the container, but actually the images inside them, they actually overflow to the right hand side of each column. You can't see them with the first 3 columns, but you can see it with the last column, and you can see that the column actually ends there, and that's where the color ends, and then the pictures overflow to the right of that column. All right. Now, why am I doing this? That's because I want to show you how images will behave and how they're going to resize depending on how you set the width of the parent of that image or picture. When you set flex to 1, it doesn't mean that your flex items are going to occupy 1/4 of the width of that row. It doesn't mean that really. It just means that you want to distribute the width of the container equally between your flex items. But this will not always work if something happens, like having images like this not fitting into your columns if you give them only 1/4 of the width of the row. So setting flex to the same value for all columns is completely different from setting the width of each column to 25%. Okay, so let's give our images a width of 100% so that they follow the width of their container when setting the flex property. And let's go back to the basics and just create a test div at the end to see how images behave inside a div. So let's give this div a class test div, and let's create an image inside it. So let's pick this image, for example. So that's our image. Now let's go back to the images and remove the width set to 100%. Now the width of the image inside our test div is just the initial width of the image. Now, what if we give our test div a width of 100 pixels? And let's give it a background color so that we can see it. Like this. So that's our div, and that's the image inside the div. Now the image overflows outside the div until you set its width property to something like 100%, and then it's going to resize to fit into your div. Okay. So what's left to do is to make sure that if we reduce the width of the container, we decrease the number of columns inside our flexbox. So the trick here is pretty simple. All you need to do is give your flex items, or your columns in this case, a minimum width so that they don't go below that width. So let's go ahead and try that. So let's give them a minimum width of 300 pixels, for example. Let's also make sure that the flex wrap is set to wrap. So now if I reduce the width of the container, the width of the columns is not going to go below 300 pixels. This means that whenever we hit 300 pixels, then we just create a new row. All right, and just make sure that you do understand how this works. So that's your first flex item with a blue background. And that's your second flex item. And you've got a new row starting right there. So that's your third flex item. And that's your fourth flex item. Okay. And if I decrease the width of the container further, then we end up with only one column. Or to be accurate, one flex item per row. So we've got 4 rows, and inside each row, we've got one flex item. So that's the first flex item with a blue background within the first row. And then that's the second flex item within the second row. And then that's the third one within the third row. And that's the last one within the fourth row. Now you can remove the background colors, which we just used to identify the different flex items inside our Flexbox. Alright, hopefully this example gave you a good understanding of how to use Flexbox to build a nice picture gallery. In the coming examples, you will see more examples using Flexbox to build beautiful layouts.